Hi everyone, I'm Dale Smith, aka Journo Dale, and we're here to talk about Canadian politics. All right, we're here with University of Alberta's energy economist Andrew Leach. And to start off, I'm going to preface this conversation by one of my pet peeves about the whole Trudeau saying there's no economic case for East Coast LNG is that a certain political show host will badger and hector every foreign leader who comes on her show until they say in some way or another that they would buy Canadian LNG, and then ignores when they caveat it with things like if it's available at the right price. So with that in mind, I thought we should have a chat about the fact that East Coast LNG is resurrecting itself like a zombie once again, and the notion that we should be sending it to Europe, particularly now with the Strait of Hormuz issue. But East Coast LNG is not a new idea, and Andrew knows more of the history of that. So why don't we start there?
Sure. Well, I was sitting here trying to think about who you're. Is sub podcasting the appropriate word here, or sub YouTubing? But we do see that distinction a lot, where somebody's gonna say, like, if there were Canadian LNG available, would you buy it? And the answer is, kind of the same as I'd give if somebody said, like, if there's a new road bike available, would you buy it? Well, if it's at the right price, I probably would. But that's separate from the question of, am I willing to pay, or was I willing to pay the price that it would have taken to get one of those projects off the ground? And LNG is really hard because of the nature of the investment. You put a lot of upfront capital into a liquefaction project that is essentially a bet on the price between, if it were Saguenay or Goulboro, Nova Scotia, between there and wherever your delivery point is, Europe. And if you don't have enough price difference, it doesn't matter if people are using the gas. Is there enough price difference over the long term to recoup the capital cost of that project? And, when push came to shove on LNG and the East Coast, the project proponents found it difficult to find anyone. I think there was one small Spanish contract, if I remember correctly, for Goulboro, that would have said, we'll pay you enough on a long-term contract to make it viable for you to liquefy and ship the LNG. And, that in hindsight, if it were available to you now, would you sign that contract and magically make the LNG terminal appear? The answer is probably yes from a lot of European proponents. But, we can't go back in time magically and create those projects.
Yeah, and I seem to recall we had a conversation at some point that the long-term that we're talking about for an LNG facility is somewhere in the area of like 3 or 4 decades to make it worthwhile.
The contracts would probably be more on the 15-year range, but yeah, you'd want to be the equivalent of someone building a new high-rise building, right? You want to block out some of it with new condo tenants or long-term leases or what have you to underpin the investment. So a new terminal is going to need some share, not 100% probably, but it's going to need a substantial share of longer-term contracts to underpin that investment, at least for the front end of the project.
Right. Okay, so the other thing with East Coast LNG is my understanding is that there's not a ready supply locally in the area. It would either need to be pipelined in from the west or bought coming up from the U.S. Am I correct in that recollection?
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly some gas potential, whether it's Quebec, St. Lawrence lowlands, offshore Nova Scotia. There is some gas production potential, but I think when we're talking about the volumes that would be large enough to materially affect European dependence on Russian gas, right? Because we're not saying, could you send a small tank of gas to Europe? We're saying, can we make a material difference in the energy crisis that Europe faced after the Ukraine invasion and or after the crisis in the Middle East that we're seeing right now? And, in order to get that, you're going to need exactly what you said, more volumes piped up from the US into Nova Scotia, or the Saguenay project, which was picking up on volumes that were moving across Northern Ontario in the Trans-Canada Pipeline and shipping them further east. That one, I mean, it's tough in part because Quebec said no to it, right? So
Yeah.
this is, we have a federal government that hasn't historically taken jurisdiction over LNG projects themselves. That pipeline would be a federal pipeline, so there's some scope there.
Hmm.
And there is still underutilization on that infrastructure coming from the west. So, it has some, at least relative to building a new pipeline from the west, it has some attractiveness to it, but you still got a long pipeline through from Ontario, from the Ottawa River across to Saguenay. And then you have the construction of the terminal and all of the shipping infrastructure and such that goes with it.
Yeah. The construction of that terminal is another one of those things that's come up in the last few weeks, because when Polyev went to Germany, he visited an import terminal there and was crowing about how they built it in something like 196 days, and why don't we do that? Ignoring the fact that that had been on the books for them for a good 20-ish years, that the process had been underway. And you also made some comments about the fact that import and export are very different, and just if you can explain that difference as well.
Yeah, so an import terminals are relatively, maybe a quarter the project capital cost. I don't know the exact numbers, but in that ballpark. So a much less complex project, and timelines are going to be shorter, et cetera. And one of the issues I took in that particular context with Mr. Polyev saying, like, why couldn't we do this? Well, okay, let's take a trip back. Let's, in what were we, 2006-7, we were permitting import terminals on the Canadian West Coast. Those didn't end up getting built, but one of them, the original Kitimat project that Galveston LNG proposed, that one was, if I recall correctly, fully permitted in kind of that 08, 09, 10 period. So, you had a period of 4 plus years of Harper strong minority, then majority government, where, that project built a dock and a road, and that's about it. And of course, there are reasons for that. Other projects that certainly didn't get built in hundreds of days. And so, and I point that out not just on the hypocritical stance, but I think maybe there is, and I was thinking about this in the lead up, we seem to have this suddenly bipartisan agreement that we need to do something different with our major project approvals, whether it's Prime Minister Carney, Bill C-5, the chorus of conservatives saying, this thing is clearly broken. If it's, Gateway, okay, that was pre-2012 legislation. If it was Trans Mountain that was broken, okay, that's 2012 era legislation. If it's present projects, well, that's 2019 Impact Assessment Act and Energy Regulator Act regulation, the new projects. Yeah. So it's almost, if you go through that sequence, we have near universal agreement that something is busted, that maybe we're substituting time for political challenge or something. And so I think that's worth digging into. I don't think there's necessarily a reason why, Germany does something in 100 months. They're under some serious pressure, of course. But I don't think it's necessarily like we now start to talk about pipelines as though, from stem to stern, they have to take 10 years. And I don't think we need that either, right? I don't know that you're solving a lot of the problems with just 10 years of process. The disputes over those projects are going to be pretty much the same 10 years from now as they are today.
Yeah. And the other thing I would just mention was that with the 2012 Harper era legislation, that just wound up creating a lot more litigation than it did anything else. So
I don't know that I think the 2012 legislation came in a period where there was a rising tide of litigation. But Gateway, for example, substantial litigation on that project, that was under 92 era. It was a Harper era joint review panel,
right?
But it was under 1992 and 85 Environmental Assessment National Energy Board legislation. So I think what you saw in that time frame was, number one, a lot more concern and attention to climate change, a lot more of that directed, like this sort of strategy of constrain resource production by stopping pipelines. That hadn't been a view before that era. So I don't know that I'd pin it in any part at all. I mean, we've seen it before and since the Harper era legislation. So we see it under modern Impact Assessment Act era legislation going to come through as well. So
Okay.
I don't know that I'd pin it on that. I think it was certainly adversarial, and it's like the genesis was we're going to get projects through, but realistically, it didn't really appear to speed anything up. And certainly, given the Trans Mountain experience, it did not, provide a barrier to litigation or to provincial opposition or anything like that.
Yeah. All right. So circling back to East Coast, the other thing I seem to recall having a conversation about when it comes to supply is that if they are importing it either from the West or up from the States, that what that inevitably does is drive up costs for local consumers for that gas.
Yeah, I mean, LNG is, in that sense, it's a consumer, right?
Yeah.
So it's in, whether it's in, we see now in BC that the BC, what's called the Station 2 price, or the trading hub in Northeast BC, that prices there are being pushed up above what they would otherwise be because of LNG Canada. But there's also more production in the system because of LNG Canada. So, it's a new price, and that I think would be true to some degree if you're going east. Now, caveat that, and I'll be careful here, because we do have underused pipeline infrastructure going east at this point. And so, your tolls on your pipeline from Alberta to Northern Ontario are going to be determined as a function of how much volume we're moving across that system. We still move less than we used to. So, insofar as we were able to move more volumes on that system, that's going to decrease those shipping costs a bit. Great. Lower costs for Ontario consumers, as well as a little bit lower cost for Eastern movements, but then you got to build another pipeline. So there's some costs on there too, depend on how that pipeline was built in terms of whether it's integrated with an existing system, whether it's a standalone project, how the tolls are determined, et cetera. But, for that project, if you're thinking of Saguenay, it's going to be probably the sole consumer on that line.
Yeah.
There are other projects, that people talk about. For example, we have gas pipelines that extend into Quebec, but we have no gas service into New Brunswick. And so, there is at least talk of the potential to extend pass through Quebec into New Brunswick, and that would give you potentially export if you wanted it, but it also would allow you to displace some industrial use of coal and fuel oil, gives you another option on the heating side. So, lots of moving parts are potentially triggered there. Not just this, okay, we have pure gas, we have, gas that would be coming in only for an LNG terminal.
Okay. I guess the other question I would have when it comes to East Coast, not necessarily Saguenay, but outside, if any of the Nova Scotia proposals, is there enough electrical capacity for liquefaction, or would that also become a challenge?
Yeah, so there is that interaction, and we see this on the West Coast as well. And it'll interact with federal regs on clean electricity down the road. Are you using electricity to drive the liquefaction? Or are you using natural gas to power the liquefaction, to liquefy the balance of the natural gas? And most facilities are gas drive. You may have provincial regulation, as we see in BC, that was trying to push electric drive, and then the federal clean electricity regs after 2050 would mandate you to do something, whether it's electric drive or carbon capture and sequestration potentially. So there is some interaction there,
Okay.
but I think all of that is probably a little bit up in the air, and maybe we're too far down the road if we're talking about that. I think that the broader economics of the project matter a lot more than that very specific piece.
Okay. I just seem to recall that there was some tie-in between Site C in BC, which is the hydroelectric project, and the LNG projects that they have underway.
Yeah, so BC had provincial guidelines that were going to require electric drive, which then requires a whole lot more reliable electricity supply into some of those regions. And so insofar as you had a similar policy in Nova Scotia, then you'd want to think about more electricity Nova Scotia Nova Scotia would like to greatly expand its electricity production and its electricity interties to the rest of Canada. So again, it's not inconceivable that you see a link there.
Okay. All right.
It's a lot of, to borrow, I know you're going to come to Jason Kenney, but this is a lot of that sort of massive infrastructure project construction, and at the scale that, it would sort of disrupt the usual equilibrium in all of these markets.
Yeah, and that's kind of where I wanted to go next was just this notion that why can't we just do this immediately? And I guess what the barriers to that wind up being, particularly economically.
Yeah, I mean, back on former Premier Jason Kenney, I mean, he had a piece earlier in the week that I'm not quoting him, I don't have it in front of me, but something basically saying this is a wartime scale effort in the same way as we might have manufactured planes in the Second World War, or other equipment now, and send it to Ukraine, that we want to think about gas and this East Coast gas in the same light. And on the one hand, okay, certainly more in his purview than mine to talk about sort of those defense type spending, et cetera, given his history. So I don't want to step too hard on that. And in a way, it's that's the right way to think about it, right? It's not this, oh, well, but for Trudeau standing in the way, this would be an economically viable opportunity. I think the market's telling us that, left to their own devices, European utilities have not been willing to pay a premium for security of supply. So they were, clearly had expanded dependence on Russian gas. There was increased potential dependence on Russian gas prior to the Ukraine invasion, with new pipeline capacity, et cetera. So that's certainly been there in Europe. That strategic space has changed. I think if we're having a conversation about, okay, this is what we should do as a help our allies type investment, okay, let's do the math, and let's then bring in not just the question about the gas resources, but bring in maybe this is a Phil Lagasse question or a Roland Paris question or whomever it is. It's that's a harder thing to put a dollar value on. But usually when confronted with that sort of thing, I often ask who is we in this context, right? When we should do this, okay, Canada's going to do this. Is this the best way for us to support our allies in, whether it's Ukraine or whether it's our European ally or broader European context? Is this the best way to do that? And is that really going to be, if we're talking about a new terminal, we're probably talking about 5 years out at the earliest.
Yeah.
And so, what is it that we think that the Europeans are going to want in 2031, 2032, and forward on from there.
Yeah.
And Europe has still been very hesitant to make those kind of long-term commitments to gas. So, I think there's something there, and again, it's a little bit outside of my purview to say kind of what should Canada do from a security defense perspective, but I do, at some point, I think I had a tweet out last week or the week before that said, on some of these questions, whether it's pipelines or LNG, it's like high prices, low prices, no price change, fast price change. Under any circumstances, the same people have been saying, well, we need to do this.
Yes.
And so, I find, well, okay, now we need to do the thing that you said we needed to do for a bunch of other reasons for the last 10 years. Now we need to do it, but for different reasons. That's definitely true in the oil pipeline file. And it's kind of true on the LNG off the East Coast file now, I think. So be a little hesitant about that.
But maybe, I would also add that, as a policy hammer where everything looks like a nail, pipelines is one of them, and killing the industrial carbon price and essentially scrapping the bulk of federal environmental legislation is the other hammer that keeps getting wielded as the solution to all of our problems.
It turns out that, killing the carbon price on diesel apparently did nothing, because it apparently still exists and still affects trucks and is still just carrying on every day. So it's, I find that one, if you'll permit me a second on that, right? I find it really interesting where, 10 years ago, 5 years ago, if you would have had an environmentalist talking about, how emissions intensive, how dirty our different supply chains were, whether it's like the food in your grocery store or the fertilizer and farming and all of this. And people would have we might have had a convoy or something, tractors on the hill to protest this. But now we're having the same discussion, but it's actually the people who purport to be in favor of Canadian agriculture, who, they're saying it in different words, but they're effectively saying like, Canadian agriculture is more emissions intensive than you could ever possibly imagine. And like that we went from a world where, the grain truck and the food truck and the everything truck was paying a carbon tax and the grain dryer was paying a carbon tax and everything else. Now it's like, yeah, but the steel to make the grain bin has some embedded carbon tax in it. So that's basically the same.
Yeah.
How many, no, we're not using up grain bins every day, right? That's not like every month. It's not like, oh, I need a new grain bin on my
I don't
farm.
need a new tractor every 6 months.
Yeah, and so while it's true that the industrial carbon tax, to the degree to which these goods are manufactured, the steel is produced in Canada, it has a small impact on the cost of that. The embedded share of that in the cost of our agricultural products, or the share of total agricultural energy use that is like the steel and grain bins and tractors, is tiny.
Yeah.
And I think when we were talking about the consumer carbon tax, it exempted a lot of on-farm fuel use, but it left grain dryer like propane for barn heat or natural gas for barn heat or grain dryers. That was still in. And, that had a small impact on the total energy bill on farms. And then, of course, truck transportation was in, and grocery stores and warehouses, et cetera, were paying carbon tax on gas. Now that part is all gone, and we're somehow having this conversation but that had no impact.
Yeah.
Right? And the math just doesn't work.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. So my last question, I guess, is just, I guess, from your experience. I mean, we're all very concerned about what the impact of what's going on with Strait of Hormuz and everything right now is. What is your estimation of the likelihood that this will simply push Europe in particular to decarbonize further rather than look for alternate supply like from Canada?
I think it's an all of the above. Right, and you're seeing it now, and I wrote about it. Andy Revkin, that used to write for the New York Times, brought back an old blog post of mine from 2011 when we were talking about going back to high oil prices, and he posted it the other day and was talking about how I'd sort of changed his view on this back then. To say people are chasing energy. So that means that, yes, they're going to chase renewables where renewables are cheap, but they're also going to chase stuff like we saw news stories about Chinese coal to liquids and coal to petrochem pathways. We see Japan looking at, yes, restarting nuclear, but we also see them relying more on coal. Certainly China, while yes, they've built massive amounts of renewables and electric vehicles, they've also built, I was talking on The Current about this last week, incredible amounts of coal. And so I think in the absence of concerted efforts to target or to advantage clean sources, what people want right now is energy. So if you give them, there's a bunch of options on the table, okay, give me all of them. Because, the scale of disruption, Rory Johnston's been doing great work on this, but I really don't think people have internalized how big a disruption this is. If you think of 20 million barrels a day, maybe, with some mitigation stuff, maybe 17 or 18 million barrels a day, that's April 2020 level reductions in consumption. And so that was the impact of when we all stopped flying and we all stopped traveling and we all stopped going to the office and everything shut down in large part across the whole world. That was like a 20 million barrel a day hit at peak. And so the scale and right now we're all sort of, that's certainly not what's happening, at least here, in response to the oil price crash, right? Gas prices are more expensive. People are, I'm sure, substituting to some degree, but we're not seeing anywhere near that disruption of consumption to match that disruption of crude movement and supply. And so, right now we're relying on stocks and inventory, et cetera, that sort of cushions it. But it's very quickly going to, and I saw Rory writing a piece the last couple of days, it's very quickly going to manifest into real physical commodity availability. Fertilizer in the US, for us, that's maybe less of a challenge because we have some domestic production, but again, it's just going to start to filter through everything.
Yeah.
So I think it's going to get quite real quite fast. And the same as East Coast LNG is telling people aren't going to be able to just build new renewable supply they're going to find whatever they can find at this point. And in some cases, that's going to mean we're restarting the plants that we mothballed or that we've been using very little for the last little while because they give us an option that isn't expensive natural gas or unavailable fuel oil.
All right. Well, thanks for taking the time to do this. This is incredibly interesting. And we'll chat again in the near future.
That was fun. Thank you.
All right. Cheers.
See you.
And that's everything for this week. Join us again next week for some more Canadian politics. I'm Dale Smith. That's at journo_Dale on Twitter and journodale no _ on Bluesky. And don't forget to like the video, share, subscribe, and support us on Patreon. Thanks, everyone.